Hello friends, Pastor Drew here. I'm excited to share with you about our sermon series we are beginning this Sunday entitled Growing Up with Jesus, the Christian Faith According to James, the brother of Jesus. Did you know that Jesus had a brother named James, that Jesus had quite a few brothers and sisters? Indeed, Mary and Joseph had children of their own after Jesus, and one of them was James. James is a very significant historical figure in the early church. What we know about him is just a little bit, but according to the Gospels, during Jesus' earthly ministry, James was suspicious of his brother and did not believe that he was God's Messiah. If you have siblings, perhaps you can understand the complex sibling dynamics that would have been in their family and caused his suspicion. But nonetheless, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15 that after Jesus resurrected, he made an appearance to James, his brother, and that this resurrection appearance changed James' mind, and he began to follow Jesus. And not only that, but James ended up becoming one of the leading voices of the early church. Paul calls him a pillar of the church in his letter to the Galatians. And in the book of Acts, we have multiple occasions where James leads the church in hard times and became kind of the leading voice of the Jerusalem church. We see this in Acts 15 at the famous Jerusalem Council, where the church gets together and decides to include Gentiles into the church. They had previously cut them out and said the church is only for Jewish folks. You have to convert to Judaism to become a Christian. But then they decided, based on the testimony of the Gentiles, the movement of the Spirit in their lives, that they would open the church for all. And the person who mediated this council was James. He was known as James the Just in his latter years. He was a peacemaker. And tradition has it that he continued to preach in Jerusalem and lead the early church until he was martyred, thrown off the temple by a group of Pharisees and stoned to death. But his legacy lives on. And he wrote one of the books in our New Testament. Now, you might be surprised to hear that despite being Jesus' brother, despite growing up with Jesus and perhaps knowing him better than any of the other leaders in the church, the Epistle of James has one of the more controversial histories in all the books in the New Testament. It was one of the final books to be canonized in the New Testament, along with Revelation. It wasn't canonized in the New Testament until the year 393. Martin Luther, the great reformer of the church in the 1500s, who started the Protestant Reformation, absolutely loathed the book of James. He tried to have it taken out of the New Testament in the 1500s. He called it an epistle of straw, meaning that it was empty and worthless. Luther's issue with the Epistle of James was for two main reasons. The first was that the Epistle of James is not evangelical. It's not interested in converting non-believers to the faith. It's written to an established group of Christians, mature Christians. Luther's second problem with the Epistle of James is that James speaks so much about right living, about being doers of the word. And Martin Luther couldn't stand that. Luther lived in a time where the church had turned good works into things that you had to do to earn salvation, rather than things that you did because you loved Jesus and your heart was transformed. So Luther tried to have the Epistle of James taken out of the New Testament. He was unsuccessful, but nonetheless, it still is controversial. Many churches, many pastors, many denominations do not preach on James, do not care for it at all, do not even have commentaries released on it. However, John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, was a big fan of James. If you know anything about Wesley and the history of Methodism, you can imagine why. Wesley was a very practical man. Wesley was someone who cared less about everyone believing the same thing, but more about changing the world and bringing God's grace out to everyone and being flexible in how we do so. For Wesley, being doers of the word, doing good works, was not something you did to earn salvation or to check off a list. It was something you couldn't help but do because God's grace had changed your life, touched your heart so much. It was something that the Holy Spirit moved you to do as someone who was going on to perfection, who was wrapped up in the arms of God's sanctifying grace. Sanctifying grace. That's what the Epistle of James is really all about. As United Methodists, we believe that there are 3 types of grace that God uses in our life. Prevenient grace goes before us. It is God at work in our lives before we even know what the word God means, before we even know who Jesus is. When we are lost, when we are in despair, God is still searching for us. The second type of grace is justifying grace. A lot of traditions only believe in justifying grace, but this is just the second stop on our tour. Justifying grace is what happens when you come to accept Jesus' love for you, when your heart is strangely warmed, when you are quote-unquote born again, if you will, and you accept Christ into your life, and your life is never the same again. But that's not the end of the story. Simply repenting and believing is not the end of the story. We have the third type of grace, which is sanctifying grace. We believe that we are on a journey and we're trying to grow more perfect in love, trying to grow more like Jesus every day in our lives. We're trying to go on to perfection. That is God's sanctifying grace at work in our lives. And that is what the Epistle of James is concerned with. James is writing to mature Christians who are growing in their faith, growing in discipleship. And that's what I hope this series will do in your life. It will help you grow in your discipleship. Indeed, James, the brother of Jesus, grew up with Jesus literally. And in his letter, he invites us as followers of Jesus to grow up with Jesus spiritually. I hope you'll come join us at Salem and learn a thing or two about what it means to grow up with Jesus.